there's some people who think this whole claim that there are actually cultural differences of any significance by race in the United States is wrong. You called attention to the acting white phenomenon. He denies that it exists. He says it's bullshit. Says any claim about laziness and, not willingness to work is simply wrong. Any claim about a proclivity to violence is simply wrong. Any claim that family structure differences by race in terms of out-of-wedlock birth rates or multiple partner paternity or anything like this have any implications for child development that helps to explain racial inequality is simply false. I think he's wrong.
Tom Sowell, real quick. Yeah. Rednecks. Tom Sowell's idea is that Black violence, and if one wants to say that there's a Black disinclination to work among poor Black people, if that's true, that it comes from redneck white culture that Southern Black people were minted in, and that this comes in turn from certain kinds of violence-prone, hyper-masculinized, for example, Scottish Highland culture, and that's why things like Chicago murders among Black boys for no real reason in the summer are happening, that this comes from the rednecks. And I found in general that many of Tom Sowell's fans just love that book, where he outlines this, and they just figure what Black people are doing is imitating. It comes from this redneck culture.
Give us the title of the book. I forget it.
Black, Rednecks, and White something. It's one of his more read books. I read it too long ago to be able to quote it chapter and verse, but it's this idea that it's not that there's something wrong with Black people themselves, but that Black people are still imitating this hillbilly, redneck, Hatfields and McCoys culture in circumstances such as modern cities where that kind of behavior is counterproductive. And Hannah thinks that that's ridiculous. I've never heard anybody take it on before. Anybody I've ever heard talk about it says, oh yeah, that must be the issue. And
okay, so this is Scotch-Irish culture. This is the South in the early part of the 19th century. And this is hypermasculinity. This is a proclivity to violence, a vendetta kind of social phenomenon that goes on. Now, this observation is familiar to me from long before Thomas Sowell wrote that book. There was a book by a man called Fox Butterfield, a journalist writing for the New York Times for a while, called All of God's Children. And it's about, I can't remember the gentleman's name now. It starts with a particular African-American criminal who committed a series of heinous murders in New York City, but who had come from a county in South Carolina. That's where he grew up. And Butterfield, Babbitt, or not, it's probably not Babbitt. Anyway, the name of the criminal in question. And Butterfield starts with his case and sort of walks backward and goes back to this county in South Carolina where this gentleman came from, and finds that his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather were also, problematic with respect to their violent behavior and whatnot, and finds that Hatfield-McCoy type of feuds would break out, not only between Black, but also between white families. Finds, in fact, that the congressman who caned another member of Congress to within an inch of his life in the pre-Civil War
Sumner, right.
Run up
Preston
to
Brooks and
somebody got beaten half to death on the floor of the United States Congress.
Brooks on Sumner
in 1860 or 1859 or something like that. But the gentleman who did the caning came from exactly this district in South Carolina, from which the family of the murderer that Fox Butterfield is focusing on and All of God's Children had come. In any case, what he does in the book is argue that this cultural tick, if we want to call it a tick or problem, was common as between whites and Blacks who emerged out of this hill country in South Carolina and migrated to the cities on the Eastern Seaboard and into the Midwest. And so there's more in common than you might expect across the racial lines on these issues. It's not just Black culture. I can remember this argument, and the book was a bestseller and, got a lot of attention when it was published 35 years ago or whatever. That's the kind of thing that Sowell is talking about. Now, it's one thing anecdotally to take a case and to, trace it and identify it. It's another thing to say that the exchange of revenge type killings, such as what are playing themselves out between gang members in Chicago in the year 2021, is a present day manifestation of this very same cultural trend, because a lot of stuff has intervened between Blacks in the 19th century and the nature of social life on the streets of a big city in 2021, like the war on drugs, like the welfare state. A lot of stuff has intervened. Okay, I suppose I should say Jim Crow segregation and job inequality and poverty and deindustrialization. Okay, a lot of stuff has intervened. So with so many moving parts, one doesn't necessarily view with confidence the attribution of causal significance that Sowell is making to this particular feature of American culture. It's not without interest to note that there is some influence. Jim Webb, the former U.S. Senator James Webb from West Virginia, also, from Virginia, not from West Virginia.
Just Virginia.
Also, he has a book where he is calling attention to the cultural specificity of the Scotch-Irish origins of many of the residents of Appalachia through the various states where the Appalachian mountain chain runs, where you have some of these same cultural features. And Hillbilly Elegy guy, what's his name?
J.D. Vance.
J.D. Vance also touches on this kind of thing. So I wouldn't write it off altogether, but I wouldn't take it as being the be all and end all of explanation in this regard.
I've always found that the only argument of Tom's that I'm not blown away by, for the same reasons as you're mentioning, I think of, Italians, Puerto Ricans, same culture when poverty is involved. I don't find it especially a Black thing, or especially a Black or a Scots-Irish thing. I've never found the arguments never fully rung the bell for me, especially because a lot of what Tom is referring to, I'm not sure anybody would have said that about Black people in general in 1925. Maybe there's the laziness that people would mention. You can get a little bit of that in Du Bois when he mentions some Black people of a certain stratum, are lazy. But the idea that there's this unique propensity for illegitimate childbirth and utterly gratuitous violence and raucous music, as he puts it. I don't know, maybe the raucous music, because that's what people thought of ragtime and then jazz as being, but I don't know if you would have said it then. A lot of it to me seems very post mid-1960s, and there's so many factors involved. But on the other hand, Hannah seems to just dismiss the whole idea out of a sense that a culture corresponds to present day circumstances, and that therefore, because circumstances have changed, how could Black people today be acting like quote unquote hillbillies in 1825? And I think that kind of takes it too far, because there's an extent to which cultures have DNA. In the analogy is by no means perfect, but it's not irrelevant. And cultures can sometimes do things that make no sense in a current context. What makes a culture discard something completely, if it does, is if it's uncomfortable, if it's burdensome. Often the thing isn't particularly burdensome, especially in the present tense. And so, of course, a propensity to violence and vendettas, et cetera, is going to have some down-pulling effects on the culture. But in terms of how you feel day to day, you could say that men feel validated and masculinized by that to the extent that there is a biological difference between men and women, and I, stand on that if boys will be boys, that is one way that a culture will give an outlet to that sort of thing. And so, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me that there might be something in Black culture today that is inherited from things that happened amidst contact between the races 200 years ago. I see no reason that could not be the case, because you see in cultures around the world that you're looking at how everything makes sense, and the good anthropologist wants everything to tie to what the river is like, what the market economy is like, what the white people down the river have been doing to them for the past 25 years. And all of that makes sense, except for about 10%, where you're wondering, why do they do that? Why do they wear those clothes? Why do they spread that on themselves? Why every week do they go down to the river and talk to those people in that weird, strange kind of language and nobody knows what half of the words mean? Why do they do that? So much of those things is now chance. Or you find out that the reason they do that is because in 1750 they did this, and now nobody remembers not doing it, and it's just kind of what we do because that's what we do. I don't know what name anthropologists or sociologists have for that, but it's very real. And here's me in my field trying to contribute. In linguistics, all of this is easy. Any language has fossilizations of that kind. You have to expect it. Part of the reason I'm so sensitive to it is because culture to me is like language. And I figure, okay, they're doing that. Just like in English, we say children and we say geese and we say oxen. Nobody knows why. I can tell you why, because all of that used to be very systematic. Who cares today? We just carry it along because it doesn't really hurt and nobody really thinks about it. The analogy is only roughly imperfect. Culture has that. And so I think Tom is not crazy to think that that might be the way it is, where I think Hannah thinks that everything, all culture is about the modern state of the GNP. I think that's not true.
Okay, let me make a couple of observations. We're talking about culture, race, and inequality. One, it has to do with slavery, a reason why I wouldn't follow Tom Sowell altogether in attributing the problematic aspects of contemporary Black culture to this inheritance from the Scotch-Irish Southern origins, because slavery was a very profound institutional imposition that could be expected to have consequences for Blacks that it wouldn't have had for whites, all of whom might have been a part of the same Southern regional subculture. Orlando Patterson elaborates that his concept of natal alienation, which calls attention to the way in which intergenerational social connection amongst the slaves was interfered with by the property right assertion of the master. He could sell off the children from a family. He could take sexual favors with the mother of the, et cetera. Must have had, argues Patterson, deep implications for the way in which Black family life evolved after slavery. And he claims, Patterson does, that he can find evidence in Afro diasporic communities throughout the world, the Caribbean, the UK immigrant Black populations, et cetera, where you see common cultural features that he thinks are, at least in part, due to slavery. So that would be one thing to say. But the other thing to say here, I think I have to at least try to give voice to it, is that there's some people who think this whole claim that there are actually cultural differences of any significance by race in the United States is wrong. Yeah. Sandy Darity, William Darity, Duke University economist, colleague of mine from graduate school days at MIT back in the 1970s, has a whole essay where he goes after Orlando Patterson and William Julius Wilson. He would have gone after Glenn Loury if he thought I was worth talking about, but he doesn't. But that's okay. I'm okay with that. And he says, look, they're just wrong. He says, for example, you called attention to the acting white phenomenon. He denies that it exists. He says it's bullshit. He says Blacks, by his evidence a greater investment in education and evaluation for their children. Why not? Says any claim about laziness and not willingness to work is simply wrong. And then he has his arguments about why that's the case. Any claim about a proclivity to violence is simply wrong. Any claim that family structure differences by race in terms of out-of-wedlock birth rates or multiple partner paternity or anything like this have any implications for child development that helps to explain racial inequality is simply false. The evidence is not there. Says people are making it up. So I think he's wrong. I think the evidence, both the commonsensical evidence and the systematic social scientific evidence is there. But then, you're going to have a fight about study X and study Y, the acting white phenomenon, study X and study Y. Some people find what they're looking for. I really think the weight of the evidence is very powerfully in favor of the existence of a depressive effect on Black engagement with academic materials based upon a association of that engagement with racial inauthenticity. I think the evidence is there.
It's painfully clear.
But William A. Darity and his ilk would deny it to the last day. Mm-hmm. So those were two comments. One of them says that Sowell may be getting it wrong because he underestimates the unique influence of slavery on culture. The other says that Sowell may be getting it wrong because he's attributing whatever cultural differences he thinks he sees to something that's all a phantom, that's all shadow boxing, because there really are no cultural differences. Everything is driven by wealth, inheritance, economic opportunity, racism, and discrimination.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very quick sidebar. Darity, Tyson, and Castellino, 2004, 2005, is about the acting white hypothesis. And it was a paper that got around at a time when papers started getting around more easily because of blogs. And that paper in particular argued against there being a unique acting white issue among Black kids in particular, and convinced a lot of good thinking people that the acting white idea is a myth. And it's interesting, if you actually read the paper, and papers like that are hard to read, they get into numbers. Very few people are going to get through the whole thing. I get it. And the numbers beyond a certain point often stymie me because I'm out of my lane. You know, I don't have the math. But in this paper, it was very clear. It was interesting, the conclusions that they actually made. They showed that there isn't this identification of scholarly achievement with white people in low performing all Black schools. Instead, where you find it is in schools where Black kids are going to school alongside white kids. Now, big surprise, of course, that's where these issues of identity would come in. But their idea seems to be that because you don't find it in all Black schools, it doesn't matter. So they show that it's happening exactly where at the same time it was being documented in documentaries and in testimonials and in journalism. It's exactly where Black kids go to school with white kids, where there are white kids to model themselves against if this phenomenon is going to express itself. Isn't that what you would expect? Now, it's an interesting nuance to know that it doesn't happen in the ghetto, as they used to say. And it's intuitive to me. Yeah, there are no white people around. But when the white kids are around, then teenagers' natural clannishness is going to kick in. And unfortunately, with Black kids, one thing that gets dragged along in the DNA these days is that sense that it's them who do the schoolwork. And yet for Darity, Tyson, and Castellino, that didn't matter. It was as if they were thinking the default condition of Blackness is to be a ghetto kid going to a ghetto school. And I guess the idea was that the Black kids going to school with white kids were such a rarity that it's 1914, that it doesn't matter what's going on in those schools. I thought that was a really lazy reading of that paper. And I was surprised that the authors intended it to be read that way.
I know what you're talking about. By the way, Fryer, who has his own papers on acting white, finds something similar. He looks at the relationship between popularity and grades, and he finds that having higher grades doesn't necessarily make you more popular when you're Black in schools that are integrated, but he doesn't find that in the schools that are mostly Black schools. Darity and company have been dismissive of Fryer's findings, even though Fryer confirms in a way the point that they're making in that paper. But you're putting your finger on the point, which is that you wouldn't expect to see the acting white phenomenon be significant in all Black schools. You would need the presence of whites as a reference for which the acting white enforcers could point to, see, you want to be like those people. And if there aren't any of those people around, that's not going to be so easy to do. I think there's an issue of fault here. I think what they're trying to do is to say there's nothing wrong with Black people. Black people are okay. Left to our own devices, we wouldn't be doing this. So this is a reaction in one way or another to white racism. Mm-hmm. You don't find white racism in all Black schools, and you don't find Black people expressing this behavior in all Black schools because this behavior is not an intrinsic aspect of Blackness. Blackness is okay. The only time you get quote unquote pathological outcomes is when you put Black people in presence of white people and the forces of racism can assert themselves. And that's a statement of faith as much as anything.
And then you get it should be an acronym. You know, it's not our fault. It's the INAF thing. But then you get into, is it true that the reason the Black kids feel that way in those schools is because of racism? Is it because the white kids don't like them? Is it because white teachers don't like them? Or is it because of racism from white teachers and students in the 1960s amidst desegregation efforts where the racism was real? And then a new meme sets in that school is for other people, which then gets carried along in the cultural DNA, which is precisely what happened. As Stuart Buck, who I don't know much about, showed in a wonderful book from about 20 years ago that nobody read. And so you can have your cake and eat it too. The reason that Black kids do that is because of racism. It started that way. But then you get into this theme of ours lately, the complexity of social history, which is that as the decades passed, that meme set in and it kept going because teenage kids like to be tribal. And one of the elements that Black kids can use is the idea that if you're a grind, then you're not one of us. There's nothing pathological about it, but that's what happened, despite the fact that the overt racism from the students and the teachers receded. And, I come from, 1978, 1984. I know what subtle racism from the white kids was like. Little things people would say, but they weren't that little. The occasional teacher who clearly had it out for you for no reason other than that you were Black. Not that they were going to cane you. You weren't going to be suspended. I was a nerd, but still you could detect biases. That's now 40 years ago. And by 20 years ago, things had massively changed. And by today, even more. But the meme persists because that's human. It's not about being Black. It's human. Other groups have other memes. And there's not enough room for that kind of analysis of these sorts of things. And I imagine that Sandy, well, I can't call him Sandy because he doesn't like me, William Darity would not want to hear this. It's interesting. I know he'd have a response, and it wouldn't just be to swat us with a bear paw, but this won't do for him.